Here, here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, most august panel, most august House. I'm so happy to be here. You know, I'm sorry to get involved in this lovers' quarrel, but I'm going to do my best to make it good right. So we've got an op-choice case for you today, and I think it's quite interesting. Some states, and pretty much all of Europe, have laws of the following sort. If an individual witnesses a serious crime, then he must, to the extent that he can do so, without danger or peril to himself or others, report said crime to an appropriate law enforcement official as soon as reasonably practical. So what am I talking about, right? Like, somebody witnesses a crime, he can report it, there's no danger to himself or anybody else of reporting it, he's legally obligated to do so. The question is, thumbs up, thumbs down, are these what are usually called bad Samaritan laws? But Samaritan laws are something else. Are these good or bad?
I have a bit of a question, and I'm not trying to be nitpicky here, but how do they define danger to yourself? Like, is it like the Mexican mafia might kill me as they potentially do, or is it like, you know, you have to, I don't know, like, not to do that?
Like, I'd say even something as minor as not taking your medicine would count as danger to yourself, like erring very much on the side of, you know, not putting them.
Are there teeth to these laws? Do they have, like, what kind of punishments would we
We're not thinking major punishments. Like, I think the way they're usually punished is with fines.
And the last question, and forgive me for even thinking of this, but are you going to have some kind of exemption for spouses, children, or no?
I haven't thought of that. Should we have an exemption for spouses and children?
should have just been an
I'm inclined to think that at least if it were happening in the United States, you already have like spousal privilege and parental privilege, so probably fall in that.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. Okay. Now you can make a choice. It's not supposed to be. Wait, no, the yellow should get to make the decision. And I got the side that I wanted. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So with that being said, I've got three main reasons why Robbie's right and the other Robbie's wrong.
Find out what the side that was picked was.
Oh yeah.
I guess we're taking thumbs
So
up.
we're taking thumbs up. We say these bad Samaritan laws are bad laws. Thumbs down. Okay, great. With that being said, we're going to get into three main areas of analysis. The first thing that I want to talk about is causation of harm and legitimate state action. Because generally, we punish people when they cause harm, not when they fail to prevent it. And I'm going to talk about the exceptions to that rule to make it clear that these are exceptions to the rule. Now, we make exceptions. We sort of punish people simply for allowing a crime, only when a contract exists, or when some previously recognized legal duty to care exists, right? We punish parents for parental negligence, or doctors for negligence and not doing sorts of things. We don't punish just regular citizens for failing to act, because we don't recognize this general positive duty to aid other citizens sort of whenever you have a chance to do so. We only punish you if you actively cause a harm, if you sort of take it upon yourself to do something bad. And they can sort of raise metaphysical questions about the action and action distinction. And that's fine, but I don't think that's the way that the law works, that the law of any sort of country works. I think we generally recognize this distinction between doing something bad and allowing it to happen. But I'm going to say that if you don't think that that distinction exists, then why would you limit the application of bad Samaritan laws to cases where reporting involves just minimal costs, right? If you really think that allowing some harm to happen is pretty much just like doing the harm yourself, then why wouldn't you say that sort of allowing the harm to happen, even if there is a great cost to yourself, should be something that we should punish? I don't think you can justify that. I think once you recognize that there is this action and action distinction, and that we only punish people for doing bad things, not for allowing them to happen, it doesn't make sense to sort of, well, yeah.
Right, but we also allow certain exemptions within the law for like self-defense and things like prioritizing your own safety. Like I don't have to jump in the water and try and save someone if there's a reasonable chance that person may drag me under as a result of that. Please tell me why I have to prioritize someone else's life.
If you think that allowing somebody to die or allowing some crime to happen is analogous to doing the crime yourself, then you don't get to justify doing a crime by saying it would have been costly to me not to do the crime. That's the argument. I think that's pretty clear, and I think they can activate this. And I want to talk about the idea of, further under this idea of causation of harm. How do we deal with these sort of ways of helping other people? We create and fund agencies who are trained to help people. Police, courts, to provide for the common security. We don't deputize each individual to act whenever you can further that end. With that being said, the second area of analysis that I want to talk about is enforcement and fairness. Because I think there's an incredibly big enforcement problem with these laws. Why is that? Well, what do you have to do to actually enforce one of these laws? You have to show that somebody witnessed a crime, and show that that person understood what was happening, realized a crime was going on, realized that it was a serious crime, right? Why is that a problem? Basically what you need is somebody who's witnessing a witness. I think that's pretty unrealistic, like it's not likely to actually happen, right? Unless you have a cop who was at the vicinity and saw somebody witnessing a crime, you're probably never actually going to be able to punish somebody for this. right? Unless there's some other incredibly good Samaritan who sort of turns in the bad Samaritan for not being a good Samaritan, you're probably never going to be able to give these laws teeth, right? Whatever the punishment is, there's never going to be a good way of showing that somebody saw the crime and knew that a crime was committed. Sure.
Okay, but couldn't there be, firstly, the testimony of other witnesses, but also, even if this isn't enforced in a whole lot of cases, won't the mere fact that you could get a ticket for not reporting a crime existing convince people to report crimes even if they're not sure if they should?
Okay, again, when you said there'd be these sort of other witnesses, there has to be this idea that there's going to be teeth. But think of the sorts of things that you can plead, right? Suppose you're in the apartment next to somebody who's getting killed. I thought the screams were coming from the TV set, officer. What I'm saying is that it's very hard to show that the state of mind of the person who was witnessing was such that they realized that a crime was being committed, a serious crime was being committed. They could have reported it, you know, that sort of thing was going on, right? So I think it's very hard for these sorts of conditions to be realized. They say if there's just some outside chance, then that will be enough. But I think it's going to be a pretty minimal chance. You're going to get pretty minimal deterrence. I also want to talk about the idea of penalties. Because suppose they do go with having these small penalties. I think that's a problem, because then bad Samaritan laws send the wrong message. The message they send is that failure to save a life or failure to report a crime is about as bad as a parking ticket, right? I think if you want to send people the message that it's important for society to actually get involved, then having some minor slap on the wrist punishment simply doesn't do that. Treating not reporting a crime like jaywalking doesn't send people the message that reporting crimes is really important and I should be terrified of this, right? Like, jaywalking is also punished, sometimes $200, but I know very few people who are actually afraid of jaywalking because the punishments are so infrequent and because it's simply not that bad given how infrequent they are. Now suppose the penalties are large, maybe they'll do that. That's very likely to be unfair, because bad Samaritans usually aren't callous, evil people, but instead are sort of panicky, unsure, they misjudge the situation. Most bad Samaritans aren't bad people. And that leads into my third point, the anti-cooperative effect. Because so far I've been arguing that even if you sort of could increase to some degree of crime reporting, then you get a benefit. What I'm going to say now is that you don't even increase reporting, you actually decrease reporting on their side of the house. Now why is that? Well, think about these people that are sort of they're not quite bad Samaritans, but sort of misjudge the situation at first, right? Maybe their neighbor is in the house next door, and they feel some sort of sense of loyalty. But they're not sure that a crime is being committed, but later they realize that a crime is being committed. Or maybe they have some very unreasonable fear of retribution, right? There's not actually a danger, but they're irrational because they're in a situation in which they've never been before. We're not saying that these are good reasons not to report a crime, but we're saying that they are reasons why somebody who, if they're seeing something they've never seen before, if they're placed in an unfamiliar situation, might not report the crime as soon as reasonably practicable, like I said in LOC, or in PMC, in the construct. Why is that a problem? Well, on their side of the house, these people that witnessed a crime and then didn't come forward are now criminals. That's just about the worst way to get them to cooperate with you. Think about these delayed Samaritans who sort of witness a crime, don't report it for 2 days, 3 days, and then decide maybe I'm going to come forward. On their side of the house, in order to come forward and talk to police, you have to ipso facto confess to a crime yourself. You have to ipso facto basically say, I'm willing to pay a significant amount of money, or at least some sort of large ticket that could get me in trouble. I'd probably rather not do that. Or think about these sort of passive Samaritans, the one who doesn't decide to go to the police afterwards, but the police come to his door and say, did you witness this crime? We're looking for information. On their side of the house, it's much easier to say, no, I didn't, officer, don't give me a ticket. On our side of the house, on their side of the house, it's easy to say that. On our side of the house, people are going to say, yes, I did witness a crime, because there's no harm to people for doing that. Basically what we're saying is that the important thing in getting people to report crimes is to cooperate with them, to make sure that they're working with the justice system, and that the aims of the justice system don't conflict with their aims. On their side of the house, you turn potential people who could report crimes, who could help you out, into criminals. You make them have an antagonistic relationship with the justice system, rather than a cooperative one. And we think that this anti-cooperative effect is sort of the main reason why you're not even going to be making there be more reporting, in addition to all these sort of reasons why it's illegitimate to require this sort of positive action in the first place. For this reason above all others, we're proud to close.
Here, I thank the speaker for his remarks. Call the Leader of Opposition, Mr. Robert Glunt, for the next constructive speech of the round, not to exceed 8 minutes. Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Everyone in this panel, everyone in this most august house, you're not the speaker, Aviva. Thank you, Aviva, also the speaker. Everyone for a really fantastic turn, and of course these guys, of course, Robbie. With that said, let's get into this. The first thing that I want to point out is that it is true that this case has very little impact. Now, I'm not going to say all the cases will impact they should lose, but I want to point out here that the mere fact that a lot of people are probably not going to be prosecuted for this law doesn't mean that the law itself should not exist. What we're going to say on our side of the house is that while it is true that a person who stands to benefit from a crime, or a person who is in cahoots with the criminal, is unlikely to report the crime just because of some minor fine that we give them, that there is still some positive social benefit, partially gained through the increased reporting of crimes, which we'll talk about on our side of the house, but also partially gained through the moral message that it sends, that enabling crimes, while not exactly the same as doing a crime, is still a wrong action, still an action which is blameworthy, and still an action which is worthy of punishment, even if it is a small one. So what we would say on our side of the house is that we don't have to show that this is an enormous impact. We don't have to show that you're going to catch every criminal, just that there are going to be marginally more criminals caught, and that the justice system will send the correct moral message to people, which we feel is good for society in a very general way. So with that said, let's get into a couple of reasons why we think you absolutely should have these laws. And the first thing I want to talk about is the obligations to the state. Because understand, Madam Speaker, members of this panel, that all of us, everyone within this country, and everyone within all of the countries that they're talking about, do have an obligation to testify if they are called upon to do so in a criminal trial. Why is that? The reason is that we recognize an obligation to the state to aid it in its law enforcing power. And we understand that there is no way in which you can effectively run a judicial system if people can just say, I don't feel like testifying, I don't feel like cooperating with law enforcement authorities. That's why we give police officers certain power to detain and question. That's why we give courts the ability to coerce people into appearing. So at the point at which they recognize, or they really ought to recognize, that people do have an obligation to aid in the prosecution of justice by providing information when it's asked, I think that it's kind of difficult for them to argue that people don't have this obligation just because nobody bothered to frame the question yet, because they don't have the information to do so. But also what I want to point out is that people can be forced to serve jury duty. People can be coerced in times of crisis to give up their homes. They can be coerced to lend their resources. At that point, I think you have to recognize that while we do recognize individual liberty within this country, that people do have obligations to the preservation of justice. And the mere fact that we have a government, the mere fact that we have police officers, doesn't mean that we all just give up these obligations that we have to each other. Everyone has to help out in some minimal way, and we're not asking for very much when you just have to call the police and say a crime occurred and you really ought to investigate it. The second thing I want to talk about is the collective action problem that often results when a crime is committed or just any sort of violent event or dangerous event results. Because a person sees that a crime was committed, they weren't personally involved, and they just assume that it will be reported. They just assume that other people will take these steps in order to report this to the authorities. And this is true of crimes, but it's also true of stuff like traffic accidents. Quite honestly, Madam Speaker, members of this panel, because we live in a culture which tends to prioritize the individual and tends to assume that somebody else will take care of it, that just telling people that they have an obligation to report a crime, even if the authorities already know about it, I think goes a long way to reporting crimes which might not otherwise be reported. We're not talking about people making a willful decision to deceive the authorities. We're talking about people saying, I'm assuming somebody else would do this, and just taking the preventative measure to assure the police that they know, regardless of whether it might have been reported elsewhere. I'll take you back in case, not quite right now. But the third thing I want to talk about here is the problem of enabling and the moral culpability of enabling. Because what I would tell you, Madam Speaker, members of this panel, is that crime doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that crime is most dangerous in a society in a culture of crime. When a person doesn't report minor crimes, when a person allows criminals to get away with things by not acting as a witness, and when a person doesn't cooperate with law enforcement authorities, they enable criminals to firstly carry out more crimes, secondly to carry out more serious crimes. Now, we're not going to say on this side of the house that merely not reporting a crime is the same as doing a crime. Clearly, me not reporting a murder is not the same as going out and whacking somebody. But the mere fact that it's not the same, that it doesn't rise to the same level of blameworthiness, doesn't mean that it's not a blameworthy act. It doesn't mean that that person doesn't deserve to be punished. When you take an action which allows criminals to continue their activities by overlooking the crime, then I think that on a certain level you have done something wrong. You've allowed the victim to suffer, and I don't recognize this positive-negative distinction that they talk about on their side of the house, that because you didn't start the criminal act, you had no part in the criminal act. That's silly. I think that Arthur Andersen, for example, the auditing firm which allowed Enron to get away with all of its crimes, did commit a criminal action, but also, even if there weren't statutes against it, the mere fact that they allowed them to carry on this deception when they were supposed to watch, because everyone is supposed to watch, I think means that they did have some part in the criminal activity and allowed it to go on further. I think this sort of analysis extends to a lot of circumstances. If I see that a person is constantly ripping off cars in a neighborhood and I never report him to the police, then I'm helping him to continue to do so. I'm instrumental in that crime, and at that point I deserve to be punished for it. With that said, I want to go back to case. The first thing that Dan talks about is the distinction between doing something and allowing something to happen. And he says that they're not exactly the same thing. That's true. But the fact that they're not exactly the same thing doesn't mean that they're not both bad.
I don't think he gives you any positive reasons to believe that a person who knows that a crime was committed, knows that a criminal will go free if they don't report it and harm other people, but makes the positive decision not to report it to the police, to allow the criminal to continue to harm others, has not done something blameworthy, not done something that they deserve to be punished for. At that point, like, I don't care that he's not getting the same punishment as the criminal. He still should be given some kind of punishment for having done so, and people should be given incentives not to do it. Now, are those incentives going to be 100% effective? Probably not. But even sending the message that we don't tolerate looking the other way, I think goes a long way to repairing the sort of problems we have in society, the problems that everyone assumes it is someone else's fault. Sure.
We keep relying on this idea of these sort of callous, blameworthy people. But at the point where most people that don't report crimes are not doing so, not because they sort of hate the victim, because they're simply unsure, panicky, have never been in that situation, why do you think it's fair to sort of visit such vengeance upon them?
I have a couple of responses to the point. The first is, you told us in case construct that we were going to err on the side of if a person really feels that there's going to be some kind of retaliation, we're not going to punish them for reporting. At that point, I don't think you have to worry about the panicky sort of person. But also, if the worst case scenario is people err on the side of reporting more crimes, I don't think that's also a bad thing, right? If what they're worried about on their side of the house is, well, people won't be sure, is this a serious crime that I need to report or a minor crime? If they report all of the crimes, that's not so bad. And while it's true that some people may panic in these circumstances, if we don't make the fines particularly severe, the impact to society of giving these people a little bit of a fine, which seems a little bit unfair, doesn't seem to me to be too terribly bad. The second thing they talk about is enforcement and fairness. And they say, you're going to have to have people witness witnesses, and it's going to be really hard to prove it, and like, isn't that a waste of time? Madam Speaker, members of this panel, we're not claiming that every single witness is going to be brought to jail. But I think the mere fact that some of them may later be brought to jail because it's clear from the testimony of other witnesses that like they did know about the crime means that there's definitely going to be incentive to report. Nobody can be totally sure that no one else found out about a crime, and once one person reports a crime, then anyone who witnessed it is possibly suspect, possibly liable for not having reported it. So unless I'm sure that no one else saw the crime that I committed, then I have a definite reason, even if they don't have 100% enforcement, to not want to risk the penalty and in order to report the crime. But they also say that it sends the message that like helping out crime is no worse than a ticket. Like, Madam Speaker, members of this panel, firstly, on their side of the house, you send the message that it's not bad at all. So I think that's certainly a worse message to send on their side of the house. But further, the mere fact that you don't have really serious penalties doesn't mean that the crime isn't bad, just the marginal social cost isn't that bad. I'm going to give you the example of speeding. Speeding can lead to death. It can lead to serious injuries because you're simply doing something which can result in a really terrible, catastrophic event. That doesn't mean that we give people life sentences for speeding because we recognize that the marginal impact to society of one more person speeding is very low. You can have a crime which can have serious social repercussions, which can be very bad, but still have a low penalty because of the probability of being caught, because of the level of deterrence that we want. I don't think the mere fact that this is just a ticket means that like it's bad to punish them. And still, better to punish them a little bit than not at all. The last thing they talk about is how this is going to reduce reporting. They say people will live in unreasonable fear, and like the delayed Samaritans are going to be really screwed because they're going to be really afraid of this ticket. Firstly, we can give immunity to people who come forward a little bit after the fact. I don't think that we have to defend, you didn't come forward immediately, so since you didn't come forward immediately, we're going to give you this enormous fine. But also, like, as we said before, the standard for fear can be very, very generous. If you really felt that there was a probability of that you were going to be attacked from this, then you can get exemption to the ticket. All that we want on our side of the house is to encourage the people who, firstly, didn't know if they should report, or secondly, the people who don't know if it's bad to report because we tell them that you do have that positive obligation. At the end of the day, even if not a single one of them does, simply sending the message that we do have obligations to each other, and that is not just the job of the police officer to enforce the law is a good message and one that we should set. For all those reasons, we have that.
I thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the member of government to move the next round not to exceed 8 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, members of this panel, members of this most guest house. Swarthmore is running a fantastic tournament, good friends and more on side opposition, and Dan Trudeau is going to give you another amazing speech. I've been in too many of his lovers' quarrels and rounds, so he'll get over it. I want to start where Rob started, because he started by talking about sort of how this case has very little impact. And I think maybe that's true on their side of the house, but when you realize like sort of the negative harms of imposing these laws, the impacts are actually pretty big. And let's look at the ways he talks to you about sort of the very little impact in this case. He tells you there won't be a lot of prosecutions, and he tells you you'll just sort of be sending a social message. couple of problems with this. I think that having these laws has negative impacts in terms of deterring sort of someone's ability to come forward and report, particularly down the road. I think that's especially important when you look at Dan's sort of last point on case, something I think Rob wholly underaddressed. This idea of the anti-cooperative. The idea that sometimes people won't be sure what they witnessed. Sometimes they'll be afraid. Sometimes they won't understand. I think just saying, well, we'll give them, no. You're just saying that we'll give them, really not. We're saying that we'll give them sort of a generous standard of fear. It doesn't get it sort of the irrationality of, I witnessed a crime, oh my God, I'm going to retreat home. I think this is especially relevant in the cases where we would most need this help and testimony. Because in public crimes, right, where we were sort of, someone was out on the green being murdered and we all saw it, then any one person's not coming forward has less of an impact. But in private crimes, where I was sort of just witnessed something me, I think I'm going to be sort of more likely to act irrationally, more likely to retreat. And when the police come to me, or I ultimately decide to go to them, we think the harm of being afraid that I am going to be punished for a crime is a very large impact that you only get on their side of the house. This idea of a social message is, I think, irrelevant. At the point where the punishment and sort of the social message you send with just imposing a ticket or a fine is very, very minimal. And ultimately, we all agree this is a law you really can't enforce. It's exceptionally difficult to do so. You decrease sort of the overall respect for the law when you put laws on the books that you don't intend to enforce and that you really can't do practically. But the first major point we get from Rob is about obligations to the state. And he says, well, we have other obligations, like obligations to testify, to aid sort of law enforcement, and in general to do things like jury duty. He asks you why it's okay sort of to ask someone to do this, but not okay to impose an obligation. And I want to talk about two things. The first is sort of the practical problems with this argument. Because all of what Rob does here is assumes that having these laws actually helps in the prosecution of crimes. And I think for all of the reasons we talked about sort of disincentivizing reporting, particularly in cases where there are fewer witnesses, this doesn't help in the prosecution of crimes. That's not really an idea Rob ever gave a response to. He just said, it won't be so bad. We think that, in fact, you're sort of not benefiting the state in the ways that side opposition thinks you will. But to get sort of the crux of the analysis, I think what we need to realize is that, in fact, we do have obligations for the state. And the way we all sort of contractually agree to deal with those obligations is to set up agencies, like courts, like police forces, and say, these are the people who are best placed to do investigations. These are the best people to find witnesses. And we don't sort of deputize individuals to do these things. This is an idea Dan gave you on case, and I don't think it was ever responded to by Rob. We're fulfilling our obligations to the state merely by sort of being available to them to provide testimony and providing them the resources to have these agencies we think are better placed to deal with these crimes. The second point we get from Rob is about collective action. And he says people will just assume that things are going to be reported, and this goes a long way to sort of tell them that that's not the case, tell them that they should do these things. I think there are a couple of problems with this. One, I don't think it actually goes a long way to doing that, at the point where there's no real consequence, no expectation of punishment if you don't do it. Because I don't think they've ever told you on their side of the house why someone would assume that they're going to be punished, that the witnesses are going to be found, that you're going to be able to accurately assess the person's state of mind and know that they knew they were witnessing a crime. No thanks. I also think this idea of sort of a group witnessing a crime is even worse on their side of the house. Because the reality is that when you have sort of a group gathered around a crime, and we know we're all obligated to report, I think that means you know that sort of they're not going to need the information that you needed. So even if you go forth, it's not going to make much of a difference. When is that not true? It's not true when you're not part of a group watching a crime, when you're just you. And that's the time when they're going to be least able to prosecute you for this, least able to know that you were sort of committing the crime of being a bad Samaritan. The third point we get from Rob is about moral culpability. And he says, no, this isn't the same thing as doing the crime, but it's still blameworthy because it allows criminals to continue their activity. You become instrumental in the crime. I think there's a couple of problems with this. The first thing I think we're going to talk about is sort of a broad philosophical distinction about sort of what your will and character is when you allow something to happen versus when you do it. Because I think they're sort of more willing to conflate those ideas on their side of the house than they let on. Recognize part of what we punish when you commit a crime isn't just the social cost, but sort of the ill character towards the rest of society, the disrespect for the law that you demonstrated. And we think that you're not demonstrating that sort of ill character towards society when you just allow something to happen.
Matt?
Sure.
Okay, but do you really think that it demonstrates good character or fails to demonstrate bad character when I see a violation of the law, I see something very terrible going on, and I make the positive choice not to report it, not to help out the law enforcement authorities who are taking up my obligation?
This gets exactly at sort of my next response, because I think what Dan told you time and time again, and what we don't get an adequate response to, is that most of these people aren't the sort of bad characters Rob and Robbie are talking about. They're not sort of standing there and saying, I don't commit crimes, but I sort of like being instrumental to them. I like when society is harmed. It's okay that these people have been harmed. I'm not going to help the friendly policeman on the corner the way Rob tried to paint it in his POI, which was like well painted, but not in any way reflective of the real world. Because recognize that people who see these crimes are much more likely to be scared, to be unsure of what's going on. And it's not that they're rationally scared or rationally sort of making a decision that they don't want to do this. It's that their first instinct will not be to go forward. Their first instinct might not be, I know exactly what took place here. What took place here was a crime. I know who is at fault. I will go provide testimony. They may not even be exactly certain of sort of the details of what happened. That happens all the time in eyewitness testimony because people sort of have an affected state of mind. They've never been in this type of situation before. I think when you require them to report as soon as practically possible, you don't understand that situation. You ascribe to them a character that does not exist. That said, I want to go back to Case and what Dan told you. And he started by telling you about sort of the causation of harm and legitimate state action. And he told you that we punish people for harms, not for failing to prevent those harms. And I don't think this is an idea that Rob does much to refute.
On negligence?
No thanks. What he does, like, I can like rebut that point. You should have made it in your speech, but that's cool. What I think Rob does is sort of like, I'll deal with his POI in a second. POI. That I didn't even take. Jeez, guys. What Rob does in his actual speech is to tell you that sort of, you know, criminals will go free. That's the positive action. He never tells you that is a positive action, right? He's just like, no, it is. Trust us. And he says, well, we wouldn't tolerate you looking the other way. But in fact, I think, again, he sort of fails to acknowledge this idea about why we would want to impose this obligation on people who have done nothing, who have taken no step other than sort of standing near something bad happening. Why would we think it was okay to impose these costs upon them to do this? Because recognize that it is a cost to have to go forward. It is a cost to put yourself in that frame of mind, and that there are likely legal costs to having to do so, even if you are granted immunity, something I'm going to deal with later. We're not just sort of erring on the side of reporting more crimes, as they tell you on their side of the house. You are imposing an obligation on people who did nothing to earn it. I think negligence is a case where people are doing something where they have sort of an obligation and then failing to do it, but they're putting themselves in that place, and that's not something you get intentionally here. Rob fails to address our analysis about sort of why you want to limit application to only minimal cost reporting if not reporting crimes is so bad, nor does he talk about this idea that we create governmental agencies to do this work and don't deputize individuals. The second point Dan gives you is about enforcement and fairness, and he talks about how this is unenforceable because it deals with a state of mind. They say, well, we're not saying everybody has to go to jail, but I think the point of this is a law that is incredibly difficult to enforce, even in like any individual case they might put forward. And I think you have to ask yourself whether it's a good use of society's very limited resources, particularly when it comes to the justice system, to put these people, who we all agree are sort of less ill character, to trial, to use our resources to do that, when we don't know their state of mind and really can't accurately enforce these laws. We talked to you about penalties and how they send the wrong message. They say it deals with relative social costs. I think you have to ask yourself why people are legally obligated to do these things, and what kind of message having a small penalty sends if you really think not reporting is so bad. The last thing we talk about is the anti-cooperative effect, and this is really fundamental, because you just get less reporting on their side of the house. They say you can give immunity, but Madam Speaker recognized this still imposes a legal cost on people. They have no way to know for sure that they will get immunity, no reasonable expectation of immunity, and therefore no incentive to go forward. Nor does this deal with cases where the police go to you and ask for information. For all of these reasons, on their side of the house, you create an antagonistic relationship between the people who can help you prosecute justice and the people who are trying to gain justice. That's not a relationship you would want to create. It hurts the interests of the state and the interests of society at large. We're proud of this.
Thank you, Speaker, for her remarks. And call upon the member of opposition, Mr. Robbie Pratt, to look at the final constructive speech of the round.
All right, thanks to everybody in this round. SWAT for a fantastic panel. Rob for a great op with me, and others for the great things to come. Psycho for a case. I want to start my speech out with this. Honestly, Kate did absolutely everything perfect in her speech, and I'm going to criticize them a lot, but it's all Greco's fault, no matter who I am. That said, I'm just going to jump right into the arguments that Greco makes in his member of government speech that are very and the first thing we talk about is this idea of the law is based on, or that the case is like sort of low impact because the law doesn't really get enforced, but we're going to talk about the greater benefits of the messages. And Kate says no, or I mean, Greco says no, we got you, right? Like, look, the law itself, or the message is bad. It says, no, you shouldn't come forward later because we might prosecute you. And this is something that I don't think Kate deals well when Rob talks about it on case. And that's the notion of immunity. Because what Rob and I are going to defend is the notion of like the same kind of standard we use with things like negligence. The idea is we're willing to give immunity to people who come forward to the police after the fact and try and report a crime. No, thank you. What we no, that wasn't in your case. Great. Look, there are two different standards that can be evaluated. If you think we can defend giving automatic immunity to people who come forward later, only prosecuting the people we find out didn't come forward at all, we get to win the round on that point. Because, like people who steal cable, you give essentially amnesty to people who commit crimes. They're incentivized to turn themselves in, but nothing actually happens to them except you get the societal benefits. In that situation, the only people you have harmed are the ones who want to do bad things, the ones that Greco isn't worried about. No, thank you. If we can defend that, we've already won the round. I don't think Greco ever said that's not the case in his speech, because, and I think Rob's going to make this very clear in his LOR, with negligence, what we use as a standard is the notion of due care. And what we're going to say is due care is trying to come forward at some point, being willing to come forward. People who don't come forward 10 years from now, clearly that's not due care. But the people who, within some sort of reasonable time period, do that should get automatic immunity so they don't have any notion that that's not the case. No thanks. Oh, later. So the first thing my partner talks about is the idea of obligations to the states. And says, look, we require people to testify, jury duty, obligations, preservation of society, and things like that. The first response we get is, well, this doesn't actually help the society. Okay, this isn't actually a response to the argument Rob's making. He's saying, if this is helpful to society, it is okay to impose this because obligations to society exist. See us having jury duty and things like that. The other response, though, that she gives is the notion that, well, we don't deputize people, right? Like, me and Chris aren't going around with like our group of law, police officer, vengeance, vigilante justice, right? Like, she's saying that's not the case. But I don't think that's right. Like, that's the notion we're talking about. It's not that individuals are taking justice into their own hand. It's that individuals have some role to play in the legal system, be it a citizen's arrest, be it being a juror, be it being a witness. These are all places where we require people to be involved in the process. If you buy their argumentation, literally, police officers are the only people who can be witnesses. We have to have a professional jury. We have to have people, all witnesses have to be in that case. That doesn't make any sense. So at this point, I think we're winning the notion that you can compel these individuals to take this action, to be in the service, if it actually helps society. That said, our second point, which is the notion of collective action, which I think is where we're really winning the notion of whether or not this actually leads to more reporting and things like that. The response we get is twofold. It says first, that there are no real consequences to this action, so you're not actually doing it. Okay, if there are no real consequences, if nobody ever thinks there's consequence, then you also don't deter people from coming forward, and the case doesn't mean anything, and no thank you, and this case flows up, because if nothing else, society sends a positive message that, you know, you should try and at least report crimes. But what we'd say is, we're willing to say that at least some people are going to be prosecuted, and for their case to mean anything, right, they have to be willing to defend that that'll occasionally happen. Yes, we'll say it won't happen all the time. Why is this important? Because right now, there is absolutely no deterrent to being in a crowd, seeing something bad happen, and going, oh, somebody else will take care of it. Oh, somebody else will call the police. If someone is getting beaten up on the street and a lot of people see it, there is no incentive for that individual to take that action. On our side of the house, people at least think. Their first intuition is, maybe I should do something because it's illegal and something bad might be happening to me. The example I use is speeding laws. Yes, a lot of people aren't prosecuted for them. Yes, a lot of people get away with speeding. But still, our first notion is, one, maybe we shouldn't go over the speed limit, but two, there might be some harm to going over the speed limit, so maybe it's not a process that's good for me. Sure.
Most people speed lots of times, and so if you're like Kate and you speed lots of the time, you have a good expectation of being caught at least 3 times like she has been. Most people don't witness lots of crimes, and so in one case of witnessing a crime and not reporting it, there's no high expectation of yourself.
One, that means the case doesn't mean anything if that's the case. But if these laws are actually going to, like look, these laws either have some sort of effect or they don't. If they don't have any practical effect, then the reason to have these laws are the notion that, well, in general, we would expect individuals to be responsible for being active. Say we couldn't have a jury system because for some reason we couldn't compel people to do it. We'd probably still be okay with having a law that says the jury system is okay and good if it sends the notion that individuals should be involved in the process of justice. The flip side of that, then, is if they're going to argue the fact that we don't get as many people come forward, we can argue the collective action problem. And I don't think there's a real response to that. She just says, well, if it's just you, you can't get prosecution. This argument is actually pretty silly. Look, when an individual commits a crime, they assume they're not going to get prosecuted. Yet we still have laws against these people, like crimes, because we suspect that we're going to be able to punish those individuals who do it. That is, if I were to murder Chris in his sleep, I wouldn't think, oh, someone will see me committing this murder in my sleep, or someone will be able to prove I did this. Similarly, we can have a law against not reporting a crime, even though an individual might think when they don't report a crime, nobody's seeing it. If you buy their argument to its logical extension, we wouldn't have any crimes because, well, nobody who commits the crime actually thinks they're going to get punished. The third thing we talk about is enabling. And I don't actually think the response here is particularly good. She says, well, ill character is a factor we take into consideration, and most of these people don't have ill character. A couple of responses. First, she says it's a factor. If it's a factor, then we can also take into consideration the societal harms that are created. That is, if the individual is of good character, but society is still harmed, they should probably be punished, even if we just take into consideration the fact that society is being harmed. But secondly, what we're going to say is they just keep asserting that these individuals have done nothing wrong. What we're saying, what the round is about, is the notion that not reporting a crime is doing something wrong because you allow someone else to get hurt. That's the point. Not reporting that crime keeps someone out on the street. Not reporting that crime means someone getting beaten up in a back alley continues to get beaten. Not reporting a crime means you can't get the EMS to help someone who may be dying. These are all things they're enabling on their side of the house. And what we're saying is, at its basic core, this law means your first intuition should always be to protect society. They talk about, the last thing they say at this point, though, is your first instinct is fear. Okay, maybe that's the case with a lot of people. But a reasonable time period would say that maybe a day later, maybe 2 days later, then the individual would come forward. A reasonable time period doesn't have to mean 30 seconds after the crime you pick up a phone and call them. You can say you have 2 weeks to report this. You can say you have 3 weeks to report this. Give people time to get over that notion of fear. But even still, having this law says, 1, we don't accept that as a good justification, or 2, you at least need to come forward and try to defend it. That said, going back case side, because I think a lot of this round is going to end up coming down to whether or not we get more reporting on whose side of the house. The first thing they talk about is the causation of harms, and they say, look, like, the individual isn't harming anyone here, it's just not an inaction. He says, look, they're both bad actions, and you want to have this good message. They say, well, why is it a positive action, right? They've done nothing wrong. The notion is they're still harming society by not taking this action. The individual doesn't get the EMS help. Someone still gets beaten up in a back street. These are all things that harm society, that a society is justified in saying, you shouldn't do. They've never proven that there is no distinction, or there is a distinction between inaction and action, except to say, well, you're not doing anything. Again, you're not doing anything that allows people to get harmed. They say don't deputize people, and why would we only do this for minimal crimes? 1, we don't want individuals to have to choose between their safety and someone else's safety. But 2, if we do deputize people to a certain extent, see jury system, see things like that. They talk about enforcement. She says, why is this a good use of resources? We might be punishing, we might have to try people. First, you're actually better using resources on our side of the house because by reporting more crimes, you have the individuals who are getting beaten up in the back streets getting saved. You have people who would be dying because the EMS doesn't help them living. Those are all benefits on our side of the house that are worth prosecuting people. Again, we prosecute speeding tickets even though the speeder hasn't actually harmed someone because the notion that some people speeding down the road is going to cause manslaughter and car accidents that hurt people. They talk about large penalties and unfair, small penalties send a bad message. We say they send no message. The final thing they close on is decreasing reports. Here's the thing. What they're going to tell you is people won't be willing to come forward because they think they're going to be punished for this. Look, I honestly don't think a $50 penalty or a $150 penalty is going to keep someone from coming forward and say, someone got shot on my block. That's not a real deterrent. What is a notion is, if people say, maybe there might be a harm to not acting in a small case, they will come forward on our side of the house. On their side of the house, this won't be the case. There isn't this message. More people get hurt. And at the end of the day, society is still saying, and I think this is just abhorrent, that it is not within the context, the responsibility of an individual, a citizen, to stand up and help their brother. I think they should have to do this. I think this is good. And Rob's going to explain more why in his LOR.
Thanks to each of remarks. Call upon the leader of oppositions one more time to deliver the first rebuttal speech of the round, reminding him that while new arguments are prohibited, moving on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. You're all speakers in my heart. Everyone who came out to watch this round, good friends here on Psycho for a very interesting case, and of course Robbie for a fantastic MO. With that said, I've got three things that I want to talk about. And the first is this a criminal action? We tell you that this hurts society because it enables crime. We tell you that it is blameworthy. Blameworthy in the sense that if you knew a person who did it, you would say that it was an immoral action. So we say that if it's an immoral action which hurts society, the presumption must be that it is also a criminal action, something that the state has the just authority to punish. I want to point out that the only real response we get to this throughout the round is this notion of a positive-negative distinction. Now this may fly a long way in philosophy class, but honestly, I think it's a semantic distinction, I think it's a nonsensical distinction, and I don't think it's a distinction on which they can carry this round. We tell you about a lot of other examples of very negative situations in which it would seem as though there are positive obligations, or which a person is punished for not doing something rather than doing them, and I don't think they can sufficiently address these examples. If we don't recognize the positive-negative distinction outside of philosophy class, if we don't recognize it in law, then I don't think they have a whole lot to stand on at the point at which we have proven to you that they are criminals. We talked about negligence. We talked about aiding and abetting. We talked about people who are accessories after the fact, or people who failed to testify in trial being thrown in jail for failure to testify. Failure to testify definitionally being failure to do something. At that point, when we do recognize that not doing something, if it is disadvantageous to society, and if it is blameworthy morally, is a criminal action, then I see no reason why these people should not be punished, no reason why you should not have this. The second thing I want to talk about, though, is what kind of people are impacted, because we've really seen two major kinds of people that have been talked about throughout this round. The first are innocent people. People we would say are not bad people. They just make bad assumptions because of a collective action problem. They see a wreck on the side of the road, they see a person being shot, and they assume that somebody else is going to come forward, somebody else is going to take care of this. We think that these people, if there is some kind of penalty for not coming forward, if they are risking criminal action, will err on the side of caution, will err on the side of calling the police, err on the side of reporting even if they think other people are going to report, and that's going to lead to more crimes being reported, more crimes being solved, and a better society for everyone. The only response we get to this is that people won't be afraid of penalties, and if they're not afraid of penalties, they're not going to come forward. Well, we want to point out that since we told you these were innocent people, and good people, and people that aren't really all that criminal, then at that point you don't really need to scare them that much. You just need to tell them that what they're doing, which they thought was a blameless action, is actually a blameful action, actually something that they should not do, and at that point they're likely to come forward. But also, we question why the penalties aren't going to be severe enough. Understand that parking tickets and speeding tickets, not especially severe, but they still do deter rational actors, because if a rational actor knows that the cost of making a phone call is 2 seconds of your time, but you risk getting a $50 ticket when you don't do it, then you're going to do that because it's stupid to give out money, even if you do have a lot of it. So at that point, I think these people are definitely going to come forward, and at that point we get a lot more reporting and a lot better society. But the second kind of people we talk about are bad people, people who facilitate crime and just deserve to be punished. Kate says that they'll be too scared to come forward, too scared to report criminal actions. Firstly, this contradicts Kate's other response that people aren't going to be afraid of these penalties. I find it very suspect that, like, the criminal people are going to be too scared to come forward, but the innocent people aren't going to be afraid of penalties. That seems a little bit backward to me. But also we talk about giving these people immunity, and the fact that they can never know if other people are going to come forward. It's impossible to know who spoke to who has knowledge of a crime. It's very difficult to have a complete understanding of who is aware, and at that point, acting in a prisoner's dilemma, or acting under uncertainty, they're likely to come forward because the risk is very high and the cost is very low. But what I really find very suspect is when Kate says that these people just don't exist. There aren't these cultures of crime. There aren't these areas in which people facilitate crime by ignoring it. Kate, that's what a bad neighborhood is. It's a place where not everyone is a criminal, but the people who aren't criminals are either too scared or too involved with crime to report the bad things that happen. That's how bad neighborhoods form, that's how they exist, and that's how they persist. And at that point, given that there are places where people just don't report crimes and crimes go unpunished, I think that these kind of people who do aid and abet do exist. At that point, they really do deserve to be punished, or at least we need to send the message that they should. The very last thing I want to talk about is the bad message that their side sends, and a very bad philosophy. I don't normally buy into these sending the message points, But when they get up here and seem to actually believe what they're saying, I think that maybe the message really ought to be sent. I'm not trying to be mocking here, but it's true. They claim that we meet our burdens to take care of each other just by paying taxes and showing up for trial when we are threatened with jail if we don't. I don't think that's true. I think we have standards like negligence, obviously, when you have a duty to take care, but also I just don't think it's the society that we live in that says that just because you pay taxes and just because you cooperate when you're forced to, that you've actually met the obligations that we all have to each other. I don't think that's a society that we live in, but I also don't think it's a society that we would want to live in. And if the choice in this round is between a society in which we say that people do have positive obligations to each other, to take care of people and enforce the law, then I think that's a society we have to go with, even if it doesn't have a huge impact, even if we don't get a huge amount of money from these like fines. For all those reasons, we have
Here. I thank the speaker for his remarks. He called the Prime Minister, Mr. Dan Greco, to deliver the final rebuttal speech of the round, reminding him of the usual caveats on future
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I've had a great time. The first thing that I want to talk about is what Glunt talks about at the beginning of his LOR. He says, look, this action in action distinction is just a semantic, philosophical distinction. It doesn't really carry anywhere. I agree from a philosophical standpoint, it doesn't make much sense. But you have to look at our actual law and look what we actually do. There's no distinction, none that matters at all. If you walk by and see a baby that you could save, now you're basically guilty of murder for not saving it. Recognize that what I'm saying. If he thinks that it's just as bad to allow something to happen, just as bad to allow somebody to die, he can't make the distinction between why that should be punished any differently from murder, from actually taking the action. That's not a principle that we recognize within our law, and that's sort of like, to say that the law doesn't recognize the distinction is pretty silly, right? Throughout this time, we haven't actually had these sorts of laws, and we've recognized that somebody who witnesses something isn't just as bad as somebody who doesn't. With that being said, I want to get into another question about enforcement. Specifically, what does it take to convict? Because I think they've made a lot of false analogies. They've compared this to speeding tickets, where there's some low probability. But actually, think about what it actually takes to convict in this particular case. First of all, it takes another witness. But it also takes another witness who, rather than watching the serious crime, was watching you watching the serious crime, and recognize that that was happening. But also, and here's another respect in which the action and inaction distinction is relevant, it requires another witness to be able to prove something about your state of mind. He needs to prove not only that you were in the vicinity, but that you understood that a crime was going on, that you didn't think it was just sort of sounds coming from a TV set, or that you didn't think it was sort of some other situation that wasn't actually criminal. I think all these sorts of things are incredibly unlikely to come together, right? It's one thing to show that somebody was there. That's hard to do. It's another thing to show that somebody was there, knew that a serious crime was being committed, knew that it was the sort of thing that he had to report. I think given that, you have to recognize that you're never going to have an expectation that somebody's going to be caught, right? That the police are going to search out somebody, find some witness that says that they witnessed the crime, that they had a certain state of mind, and then catch that person. But then Robbie makes a huge mistake in MO when he says that our saying that means there's no impact to the case. Means it could never be enforced. Because when can it be enforced? Granted, the police are never going to be able to enforce it by seeking you out and catching you. But they are going to be able to enforce it if you confess to it by saying that you witnessed the crime. If witnessing a crime and not reporting it is like committing a crime yourself, then on their side of the house, the one time that the crime will be enforced is the time when people testify ipso facto confessing to a crime themselves. That is the impact, and that's a negative impact on their side of the house. So given that there's no actual chance of sort of people being punished, what do you get? You don't get this sort of deterrence benefits they talk about. You don't get the benefits for the collective action situations, because nobody within that collective action group, nobody within that large group actually thinks that they're going to be punished, because they don't think that the other people were watching them and can prove that they understood that a crime was being committed and they knew what was going on, and that they didn't think that they were going to be retaliated against, right? There's all these sort of caveats we put in, especially the one that they like to harp on. There's no chance that somebody's afraid of being retaliated against. Proving all that stuff is really hard and hard to get from just some other witness. You don't get any of the benefits. What sort of social message do you get? I want to talk about the social message. The message you send is, I think, laws aren't the sorts of things that we enforce all that much. They're not the sorts of things that when you violate them, you have any expectation that you're going to be punished. We think that that's just not a good message for people to have in general in society. It's not a good relationship for people to have with the law if they don't expect that there's going to be any consequences if they're violating it. But we also think you send the message that it's about as bad as jaywalking. They say, well, you need to tell them that it's wrong. But given that you're only telling them it's wrong to the extent that you're telling them that something like jaywalking is wrong, we simply don't think it's going to have all that big an impact. The last thing that I don't think we're sending the message that it's okay. We're simply sending the message that it's not societally utile, and it's not the sort of action that we require of people to make them do this. There are lots of things that you're allowed to do by the law, like lying, that we don't think are sending the message are okay by not making them illegal. The last thing that I want to talk about is the right relationship with witnesses, because I think this is utterly critical, and they didn't deal with it too well. Okay, sorry. So, now we get in Robbie this thing that I don't actually think is consistent with the case. I said in the case, as soon as reasonably practicable. That was there for a reason. But what he says is we can have this time period, like 3 weeks, during which, like, you're only guilty if you don't come forward, after those 3 weeks. A number of problems with this. For one, now your incentives are to report a crime within 3 weeks, after which it's probably not going to be all that useful. You certainly don't get the short-term benefit of reporting a crime when it might actually be stopped in process, when you might actually get information that's going to be directly relevant to safety. But also, I'm just going to say that, like, if they say that you're not actually going to be punishing it as soon as reasonably practical, there's automatic immunity for anybody who punishes it within the next 3 weeks, I think it's pretty silly to say that that actually counts as being illegal. Something that's illegal, but such that you can never be punished for it, it's a response to...
Speaker, it's a response to something that I said in my LOC about immunity.
No.
It's an extension of it. Maybe Robbie talked a lot about it, but it's still new. It's still a response to analysis.
Everyone will take it into consideration.
Robbie said automatic immunity, not case by case. That's the new point. That's what I'm responding to. But the other thing, it doesn't deal with this other really important case. Take the worst people the worst people that are likely to actually come up. They're sort of lazy people. They witness a crime, they don't really feel like reporting it because, as everybody agrees, it's very unenforceable and they don't think that anything's going to come of it. What happens even with Robbie's standard, right? Even with this very extended time period. The cops come to that person's door. They say, "Did you witness the crime?" The person thinks, I'm probably going to say no, because if I say yes, then I'm confessing to a crime myself. We think that even if you give them the sort of automatic immunity within 3 weeks, you still have this problem of when the cops come to the person's door and ask them if they saw something. Because what we think you're doing on their side of the house is fostering the wrong relationship with witnesses. What you're telling witnesses is that they're criminals. You're telling witnesses that if they want to get involved with the criminal justice system, then they have to go through a complicated process of getting immunity, of getting some guarantee from a prosecutor that they're not going to be punished. Who's going to want to do that? Kate talks about the legal costs. Who's going to want to put themselves through a situation where they feel like there's some chance that they'll be prosecuted, where they're a criminal, and where they're sort of afraid of the things that the state might do to them, when they could just say, "No, officer, I didn't see anything." All their points in this round are predicated on being able to win the point that they're going to increase reporting of crimes. But they haven't done that. I think it's pretty clear when you're never going to be able to have the cops seeking out and actually punish somebody for doing this, that the only way it can be enforced is when people confess to it. And people aren't going to confess to it. But if people aren't going to confess to this crime, that means that people aren't going to testify. They're not going to report the crimes that they see because they don't want to be confessing to crimes. And I think that is the most important issue in this round. Even if you don't buy the philosophical arguments, even if you don't care about an action-in-action distinction, they need to be able to show that you're going to increase, not decrease reporting. What they've done is antagonize witnesses, make them feel like criminals, threaten them with penalties. I see no reason why you would confess to that sort of crime.